Welcome to the Robotics and Science Fiction podcast. Today we have Tracy Pearl, professor of law at Texas Tech, who specializes in driverless vehicles. Tracy, it's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me on. I'm so thrilled.
Well, tell us about your day job. How does a law professor specialize in something like autonomous cars, which I kind of think of as being the purview of engineering?
Well, as I tell my law students, the great thing about law is that it's implicated by pretty much everything in society, right? Everything that you could possibly think of has laws and regulations that are relevant to it. And law and technology has been a really burgeoning area of research and scholarship for legal academia, because as we're developing new technologies and we're introducing them to the consumer market, we have to think really long and hard about, number one, how we protect consumers from possible glitches in the technology or by the risks that are unique to that technology, while also simultaneously protecting developers, programmers, and designers who are introducing these new and oftentimes really innovative products onto the market. And so this is a great area of research. It's an area where we need more people to be doing research because the law and regulations will have to adapt to all of these new things, that new and wonderful things that society has to offer.
So, which gets to the point, how do you know about these things, though? I mean, how much engineering do you have to know about autonomous vehicles or artificial intelligence to start talking about regulating? And how to...
No, that's a great question. And that's been a really big issue in this area of law, is that thus far there's been a real disconnect between legal scholars and lawyers and lawmakers on the one hand and engineers and programmers and designers on the other. We make bad law when we make uninformed laws. And so part of what I've been trying to do in my work is to bridge that gap, to communicate with people on both sides, and to try to bring more information to lawmakers to help inform their choices about where we're going to go from a legal perspective, while also signaling to programmers and designers, like, these are some of the things that you need to be thinking about. These are some of the things that courts are going to be very unhappy about if somebody sues you over your product. And so that's sort of my big push in my own life, is to bridge that gap and be talking to people on both sides.
Well, and of course with us, engineers need to be educated too. And it says that in your faculty profile that you write about risk, regulation, and tort law.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I know what the difference is. I mean, but on the other hand, whenever I hear the word tort, I'm thinking dessert and yummy. Will there be berries on top? And I really prefer creme brulee or something. So
Right.
what is the difference and how would they impact the development of cars?
That's a great question. So a tort is simply a word meaning civil wrong, and that is completely unhelpful as a definition. What it means is that it's not criminal. So tort law is the civil branch of law that deals with injury and risk. And so if you were to be injured by a product, like your blender explodes, you would bring a tort suit if you chose to seek compensation against the designer or the seller of that blender. Tort law also deals with things like negligence. So we want people to behave reasonably. We want people to reduce the amount of risk that they introduce into the lives of other people. And it also deals with something called strict liability, which is where people engage in activities that are so dangerous that we can't possibly make them safer. And so for strict liability torts, you are absolutely liable, even if you did everything in your power, if somebody is injured. So an example is blowing things up with dynamite. If you are involved with blasting, that's a strict liability activity. And if somebody's injured by your blasting activities, they could bring a strict liability claim against you. Now, with regulations, regulations try to do a lot of things in advance. One of the problems with the legal structure that we have in the US is it's largely a common law structure, meaning that you don't have a claim until you're injured, right? It's backwards looking, it's retroactive. Regulations seek to change that, and they try to regulate things at the front end affirmatively so that those injuries never happen. Regulations differ from laws, though, in that they're promulgated by agencies and not by Congress or by a state legislature. So we're really unique as a country in that we create agencies vested under the executive branch, like the EPA or NHTSA, which deals with cars, and we give them a certain amount of power. Congress says, this is your job. go forth and promulgate regulations to achieve the goal that we have set out for you. And that's where regulations come from. And so as a tort scholar, I'm dealing with sort of the common law, backwards looking claims, with regulations that are the forward looking claims, and trying to think about what makes sense in terms of setting up a structure to reduce risk in a fair and appropriately limited way.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. The idea of regulations being forward-looking, and with us, I do a lot of work with unmanned aerial systems, and some of them have not been as forward-looking as I'd like the regulations to be, that sort of thing. And then when I think of liability, I'm also thinking right now about Boeing and the 737 MAX. That's an amazing one. And in one of your papers, you talk about the classic scene in one of my favorite movies of all time, Airplane. Peter Graves gets sick. He's looking over at the fish, and they need to get the autopilot to engage. So they reach over, and whoosh, here comes the autopilot.
Automatic pilot. There it is.
So how does this idea of an autopilot, tie into laws and regulations? How do y'all approach that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been writing a lot about over the past couple years is how we need to worry a lot more from a risk perspective about semi-autonomous cars that are on roads right now than we should about fully autonomous cars that are not yet available. Hopefully, by the time fully autonomous, fully driverless cars are available to consumers, they will be much safer than human-driven cars. And there's really nothing any of us could do if we were in one of those cars to control how that vehicle is being operated. It's entirely by algorithm, right? The semi-autonomous cars that we have now, though, pose a really interesting threat. So semi-autonomous cars are like a Tesla with autopilot. Cadillac has something called Super Cruise. And these are autonomous systems that allow a car to, say, steer and accelerate and brake on its own, but it requires constant human supervision because there are many situations in which those particular algorithms will fail. So for instance, I have a Tesla Model S, and the autopilot works beautifully if the lane markings are really clear and bright. But if I go over a portion of the road where the lane markings are faded, or maybe they're not there at all because the road's been repaved, my car will swerve all over the road. And so what that means is, as a driver, even though I'm sitting there not doing anything necessarily, I need to be watching 100% of the time so that I can jump in and retake control if necessary. The problem is there's a lot of research available right now that shows that human drivers in semi-autonomous cars don't pay attention. They drift off their attention, they look out the window, they pick up their phone and start texting. And that's a real issue because it means that the risk that's unique to the semi-autonomous system isn't being amply dealt with by the human driver. And I love that airplane scene because I think it simulates what's actually happening in real life now. In the Airplane movie, we've got a completely ridiculous plastic autopilot, right? And it's abundantly clear just from looking at it that nobody should trust this thing to fly the plane. Like, that's the conceit of the scene, right? It's why it's funny. But as soon as the plastic autopilot is inflated, and even after it encounters problems, everybody in the plane is just perfectly happy to sort of let it do what it's going to do. And then throughout the rest of the film, people are coming and going from the cockpit. And that's what makes the scene funny, right? Is that people are trusting something that clearly shouldn't be trusted. The situation is more complex, I think, in the case of semi-autonomous cars, because on the one hand, they're much more reliable than a plastic inflatable autopilot. But on the other hand, I think that they mask some of their real limitations, and people have that same level of overconfidence. And so there are lots of videos on YouTube of people engaging their autopilot or semi-autonomous system and then moving out of the driver's seat of the car, or opening up a newspaper, or even falling asleep. And so that's that same overconfidence issue. And as a legal scholar, I've been arguing that we need to regulate semi-autonomous cars much, much more heavily than we are now. We're basically not doing anything to address the unique issues posed by those. But we're very anxious to pass all kinds of laws for these fully autonomous cars that we don't even have yet. So it's a really strange kind of situation that we're in now.
Yeah, I'm really tired of hearing about the trolley problem, and of course, look, all of the human factors research from the 60s and 70s, which dealt with autopilot. So there was a huge amount of crashes due to autopilot failures.
Right.
That makes sense, right? You're the pilot, you've turned it over to the autopilot, and then the autopilot's going to work great until the moment it doesn't. Well, by definition, the moment it drops out, something spectacularly bad has happened, because if it were normal, it would have been encoded in the range of what it could do. So what they finally learned to do is that, of course, people are going to be doing something like checking the flight schedule, doing their weight tallies, doing paperwork, is to start doing a stick shaker and start giving a little enunciator to let you know something's beginning to creep out of control. So that now you can fully engage and get in. What I don't understand, and what my friends in cognitive psychology don't understand, well, one of them had a kind of sarcastic view of this, is that it takes tort lawyers 10 years to realize all of the things that engineers were actually liable for. And it
that's right.
Over. But I mean, we know this. We've been seeing, Kaber and Inslee, Mike Inslee's work. It's like, look, you could run a black factory, but it won't work that way. The cost of it not having a human in the loop, they just can't come from cold zero to figure out how to do it.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, one of the bigger issues that we have is, lawyers, nobody goes to law school usually because they're good at science and math, right? Like law school is where smart people who aren't good at math tend to go. And I think that it can be really difficult. Like you said, there's a real lag time in lawyers sort of catching up with the engineers who've known about the problem all along. I think even worse, the judges that we have on the bench in the US, as incredibly smart and as dedicated as almost all of them that I met are, they tend to be older, right? That's a career path that sort of culminates in, your late 50s, early 60s if you're lucky. And there are a lot of judges on the bench who will stay there until their 80s. And so the technological literacy can be strongly lacking among judges on the bench in the US. This was a real issue a couple of years ago when we started having to subpoena documents from email accounts and from text messages. Nobody could figure out how to do it, and it was difficult to get good rulings on those issues because judges didn't understand what it was that we were talking about. I clerked for a judge out of law school who was 85, and he still had his emails printed out for him by his secretary, right? So here was somebody who was very, very smart, a really brilliant legal mind, but somebody for whom really technological cases were really, really difficult to understand.
Yeah, we'll see how this all pans out. But it is frustrating given that we feel there's this whole body of literature that says, well, we told you this was going to happen. Oh, look, it's happening.
Yes, right.
There was, when I first met you, I heard your talk concentrating on how to handle lawsuits with autonomous cars. And you recommended that we handle it the way we handle vaccines. Mm-hmm. So can you give an overview of that work?
Yeah. So one of the big problems that I and a lot of legal scholars foresee, not just for autonomous cars, but for any kind of technology that involves machine learning, is that a lot of the really most basic fundamental assumptions of law are challenged, right? For as long as we've had law, the base assumption in every case has been that a human at some point has made a decision. And in machine learning cases, that may in fact not be true. You might have a machine adapting its own programming over time. And if that's the case, it becomes a much trickier issue to resolve liability. Like, who can be sued for what? Is it fair to hold them liable? And additionally, there is, like you said, a real lag time between the introduction of a new form of technology and the development of jurisprudence that makes sense. We have real growing pains in law when we're dealing with something new. And so what I've proposed for driverless cars, because I believe in the technology, I think they're going to make our roads much safer. I think that they have sort of risks associated that we need to deal with. But I worry that sort of lag time is going to be really detrimental to developers of those cars, that essentially they're going to be sued out of existence before they have the opportunity to sort of perfect their product. And that was a situation that vaccine manufacturers were in the United States in the early 1980s. So vaccines are great from a public health perspective. They save lots of lives every year. The problem with vaccines is that we know that they will injure some very small number of children every year. And I'm not talking about autism. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. But we know that there are certain kinds of predictable responses to vaccines, for a very small handful of children a year. Those children's families were then turning and suing the manufacturers of these vaccines, and they were winning a lot of the time. And even where they weren't, the cost of defending that litigation was prohibitively expensive. So around 1984, we almost ran out of childhood vaccines in the United States because manufacturers stopped being willing to make them. They said it's not worth the liability exposure. So what we did is we created a victim compensation fund. And this is a fairly new development in law. So this is how it works. In the United States, when your child receives any dose of any childhood vaccine, you pay a 75-cent excise tax. You probably don't know this. This is sort of rolled into the overall cost of your visit. But that 75 cents goes to the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. And the way that that program works is if your child is injured by a vaccine, instead of going through the tort system right away, you would file essentially a claim against the fund. It's non-adversarial. You don't need a lawyer. It's basically a little bit of paperwork. And that fund, if you can prove that your child's injury was caused by their vaccine, will pay you compensation to cover your child's medical expenses. You then also have the option, you can look at what your presumed award would be, reject it, and then go on to sue into the tort system. But most people don't do that because suing is always unpredictable. It's expensive, it's time consuming. So my idea is essentially to replicate that for autonomous vehicles as a stopgap measure as we're sort of trying to figure out what body of law is going to make sense. So in my model, consumers who purchase an autonomous vehicle would pay some nominal tax on when they purchase the vehicle. I've calculated with very rough numbers that we could totally fund a fund with a tax of somewhere between $100 to $700 per vehicle sold. And if you were injured by an autonomous vehicle, you in turn could then post a claim against that fund instead of having to sue. In exchange, manufacturers who want to participate in this fund would have to agree to a certain number of conditions. Number one, they'd have to agree to share more data with NHTSA. A real ongoing issue that we have is that manufacturers are not sharing their information with government regulatory bodies, which makes it difficult to promulgate good, valid regulations. And then additionally, the second requirement for manufacturers, if they want the protection of this fund, would be that they would have to make necessary safety changes to their vehicles if NHTSA sort of identified security risks, other forms of programming issues. And so that's a way of sort of balancing out, giving them an incentive to participate while also making sure that they're adapting their product when we identify safety risks.
That is such a cool idea, and I had not known that about vaccines, and it makes total sense, and it seems very reasonable for autonomous vehicles, although I don't think some of the manufacturers could be sued out of existence, or in some cases we might want them to be, but in general, that technology was there. And what was really cool is that the name of your paper was Compensation at the Crossroads, and your papers have great titles like Fast and Furious, the misregulation of driverless cars, and Hands on the Wheel, a call for greater regulation of semi-autonomous cars.
My next paper is called Hands Off the Wheel, the coming case for banning human-driven cars, which I'm really excited about.
Oh, very cool. I used to live in Florida, and we would like to have elderly not driving. Right. But my papers, in contrast, have catchy names like Augmented Reality Browser for Points of Interest in Disaster Response and UAV Imagery. So given that, do you think lawyers have more fun than engineers?
Gosh, I think that's a real horse race, and I think the bar is really low. I will tell you that there are real trends in titles in legal scholarship, and I'm really behind the time because the trend used to be sort of punchy title, punny title, colon, an explanation of what your paper was about. And now the trend is that your title should be as short as possible. It should just be like murder. Something really short, and that signals that you're a very serious scholar. And I just can't bring myself to give my papers a 3-word title.
Oh dear, Murder, She Wrote. Oh no, wait, that's a TV program.
It's too funny. You're not serious.
Yeah. So speaking of TV and media and stuff, you've got a series you're doing, right?
Yes, so I have, along with another professor here at Texas Tech, we have a law-related film series called Lights, Camera, Law that we run in partnership with the Alamo Drafthouse. We are actually, last time I checked, the most successful continuing education series in the entire Alamo Drafthouse chain. Alamo Drafthouse is nationwide now. And it's really fun. So once a month we get together, we show a law-related film, and then we have a really short panel discussion with legal professionals and law professors. We award prizes for the best questions and comments. So we have a great time. So if you are ever in Lubbock, please look at the Alamo Drafthouse website and join us for a Lights, Camera, Law screening. We're showing one on April 30th. We're showing Molly's Game, which is about high-stakes poker. We're going to talk about tax law and about FBI investigations and all kinds of fun things.
Oh, that sounds really great. That sounds super. Well, I'm more likely to be the one in Austin than Lubbock. Lubbock's a bit far away, but it may be worth the trip to catch a panel with you afterwards.
Thanks. And we'd love to have you, sir. We always love to have people from other areas of research too.
Okay, final question, and this is probably the most important one. What's your favorite robot?
Oh, I am a real fan of the robots that were on Mystery Science Theater 3000.
A woman after my own heart.
What I loved, it was such a great series. I think is it back on television now? Didn't they make a recent season? But I think it's really poignant, even though it's a comedy show, that somebody sort of stuck in space would manufacture robots, to be a form of company and affection. I think that's such a beautiful idea. And it was such a great show.
It was so snarky. I just loved it. Just that whole, snarking their way through the movies were deservedly bad.
That's right. That's right. Nano's Hands of Fate. That's the one I always remember.
So bad. It's just so bad. Well, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thanks. This was wonderful. I had such a great time chatting.
And for everybody listening, if you want to learn more about real robots, check out my book, Robotics Through Science Fiction Explained Through 6 Classic Robot Stories. And remember to subscribe to our newsletter and YouTube channel so you won't miss a thing.